Hello everyone and welcome to the Spirit Smith and Messages Shared. I'm Carrie Smith Blacker and tonight I have a little something different to share with you. On the show, I regularly put forth stories from Spirit who have important messages to share with you. I also have started a series about your inner band guides, which are posted every Thursday evening. But tonight, I felt called to talk about some of the wee folk who might help us out in our everyday lives. You guessed it, I'm going to talk about the Fae. I have a surprise guest who actually has a fairy living in her home, and we'll get to hear a little bit more from her in a few moments. The Fae realm includes many different folk who take varying shapes, sizes, appearances. Some are the size of a butterfly, all the way up to the size of a 6-foot-tall man. Fairies are often thought of as being mischievous and even can be dangerous. But in fact, there are many of the Fae folk who are very helpful. So tonight, we're going to talk about the helpful Fae folk, which can include the following list. By no means is this an exhaustive list, though. Okay. So the first on the list are the house fairies. There are many types of house fairies around the world who help to finish up the day's work when we are at rest. Elves are also known to be excellent at spinning fibers and at stitching, making clothing, anything you can think of that has to be hand-stitched. Leprechauns, and although they are known to have a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, they are also known as excellent cobblers, or in other words, makers or repairers of shoes. The story of the elves and the shoemaker comes to mind. Dwarves, brownies, and hobgoblins, they are what we call the hairy fairies. They have lots of hair on their bodies, and they can be helpful also, but they can be as tricksters as well. But they do live in your house, and they often borrow or lend silverware or other useful household items. They bake, they cook, they clean, and perhaps most importantly, they guard the moral standing of the family who lives in their home. Very interesting. The Tengu or dryads are two different forms of tree spirits. They come from either Japan or Scotland. Dwarves are highly gifted and known for making powerful magic items. Garden and agricultural gnomes guard your garden or your field in exchange for one stalk of grain. Fairy godmothers, they come around dressed as older women, and they grant rewards to young women who treat them with courtesy and respect and are even helpful to them. The tooth fairy, well, she's a protective fairy. She takes children's teeth, which have been left under their pillow, to prevent them from being used for magical purposes. And in exchange, she leaves the child a token. The token is usually in the form of coins. Well, stories about this type of fairy are relatively recent, within the last century or so. There have been stories about loose children's what they call milk teeth and what happens to them that can date back for centuries. If you're lucky enough to have one of these wonderful helpers in your home, you need to make sure that you keep them happy by leaving them things that they require. Fairies like to have a clean home to live in, so you should always remember to sweep off, well, they say your hearth in the olden days, but sweep your floors. Leave them warm coals at the end of the day to keep them warm overnight. In our time, just make sure that the heat's on. Fairies need candlelight so that they can see to do their work, their stitching and their cobbler work. So in modern time, don't leave the candles burning, leave the lights on. Not all of them. And they are always grateful when you leave food and water for them. They can bathe. They particularly like milk and honey. And they would love if you could leave them a special place to sleep. There's many other kinds of fae folk who are not so helpful or kind, but they are definitely a story for another time. Now, as I promised at the beginning of the video, I would introduce you to someone who has a fairy living in her home. And this person goes by the name of Pauline, and her fairy is a house fairy. And although her fairy is a wee bit of a mischievous one, she's also helpful in picking up and moving things often to the correct place in the home, or leaving coins, such as dimes, for Pauline's grandson to find. So we're going to stop here and take a moment and listen to what Pauline has to say about her fairy. So, can you tell me a little bit about the fairy that lives in your home?
She is mischievous. She loves to hide things on me, and then they'll reappear 2 weeks later. And she makes pictures on the wall crooked, and she turns photographs on the table sideways. And I'm not sure if she's the one that drops dimes everywhere.
Do you know what her name is?
No idea.
Have you actually seen her?
No, I haven't. Well, I've seen a shadow of her in the hallway peeking around the corner at me.
And can you tell us what you noticed about the shadow?
It was dark. It was just a shadow.
Did she have wings?
Well, I didn't get to see that far. She was peeking her head around the corner at me.
How old is your fairy?
I don't know. I didn't think about that before. I'm not sure how old she is.
Does she talk to you?
No.
You've not heard her say anything?
No. She just likes to turn things around and move things around. Messy fingerprints on my dining room wall coming from the kitchen. And I'm not sure if they're hers or my grandson's.
And how do you know that this shadow that you saw is a fairy?
Because I have a good friend who's a medium, and she agreed with me that it must be a fairy. I thought it might be the spirit of my dad because he liked to play tricks, but she plays different tricks than my dad did. And I do hear her giggle from time to time.
Does she stop doing things when you ask her to?
No.
So she's a naughty fairy.
Yes, and I don't ask her to. I tell her that's naughty and she shouldn't do it again, but she does.
But nothing harmful.
Oh, never, no.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So we now know that her fairy doesn't speak to her, but she does giggle. She's mischievous, but not harmful. She leaves the gift of dimes. And there are some folk tales that say we must always be wary of fairy gifts. But so far in her home, Pauline has not had to worry about this. Her fairy friend has been kind. If Pauline leaves a thimble of milk or water for her, I'm sure that her fairy will be delighted. Her fairy seems to be the size of a human child, about maybe 8 to 10 years old. Fairies were originally thought of as being the size of a full-grown human, and it wasn't until the 18th century or so that fairies were known to have gossamer wings and come in the smaller size. Some say that the fae can and are shapeshifters, and they can change their size. I hope I'm able to ask this fairy that lives in Pauline's home one day in person more about her realm. Until then, this is Carrie Smith Blacker wishing you peace and happiness, everyone.